but you can't disregard this, you know? I believe God comes through us. I believe Spirit comes through us. I believe in, if you don't believe in that, the universe, energy.
Did Wayfair just acknowledge that Blake Lively was dealing with a hostile work environment? That question has quickly become the center of attention following a major pretrial hearing. And it's exactly what Andy Signore set out to clarify on Popcorn Planet with legal expert Ron Zambrano. On the surface, a recent court filing seems to suggest a significant shift, with Wayfair agreeing that, for the purposes of the trial, the jury can assume Lively engaged in what's legally defined as protected activity by complaining about what she believed to be a hostile work environment. Naturally, that wording has led many people to believe this is essentially an admission that harassment or misconduct actually took place. However, Zambrano makes it very clear that this interpretation is misleading. Under California law, employees are protected not just when they report actual unlawful behavior, but even when they raise concerns based on a genuine belief that something inappropriate is happening. So, what Wayfair is agreeing to here is not that a hostile work environment existed, but simply that Lively made a complaint, and that her act of speaking up falls under legal protection. That distinction may sound subtle, but it's incredibly important, because it shapes how the jury is instructed to think about the case. They are not being told to assume wrongdoing occurred, only that Lively believed it did and acted on that belief. From a strategic standpoint, this move is also raising eyebrows. Zambrano points out that defense teams typically avoid conceding any element of a claim, preferring instead to force the jury to evaluate every single piece of the argument. But by agreeing to this point, Wayfair may be attempting to narrow the focus of the trial, steering attention toward the more contested and potentially weaker aspects of Lively's case, particularly whether she experienced any real adverse employment action and, more importantly, whether there is a clear, provable link between her complaint and any negative consequences she claims to have suffered. Lively's argument appears to hinge on the idea that things like negative media coverage or an alleged smear campaign tied to the film's promotion qualify as retaliation, while the defense may be preparing to argue that those events are unrelated and cannot be directly connected to her complaint. In the end, while this development might look like a win for Lively at first glance, it doesn't actually confirm the existence of a hostile work environment. It simply sets the stage for a much more nuanced legal battle. It will ultimately come down to what the jury believes can be proven. So, is this actually a big concession from Wayfair? Is it being overhyped? According to Ron Zambrano, it really isn't as significant as it might seem at first glance. In his view, this doesn't meaningfully weaken the defense, because the real challenge for Blake Lively isn't proving that she complained, it's proving why everything else happened afterward. In a civil case like this, she doesn't need to prove her claims beyond a reasonable doubt, but she does have to show that it's more likely than not that the negative actions she's pointing to were caused specifically by her complaint about Justin Baldoni. And that's where things get complicated. For a retaliation claim to succeed, it's not enough to say, "Bad things happened to me." The jury has to be convinced that those things happened because of her complaint and nothing else. Every issue she's raised, whether it's problems around the premiere, negative press, brand damage, or any of the public fallout during that period, all of it has to be tied back to that single cause. The legal standard requires a clear connection, that the alleged retaliation was directly motivated by her speaking up about what she believed was a hostile work environment. If there are other plausible explanations for those events, that weakens her case significantly. And that's exactly where the defense is likely to focus. Zambrano points out that when you look at the broader picture, interviews, media coverage, public reactions, it becomes very difficult to draw a straight line connecting all of those outcomes directly to her complaint. The jury is going to be asked to evaluate whether that connection actually makes sense, and if it doesn't feel clear or convincing, that creates serious problems for her argument. From a legal standpoint, this is a tough burden. Her lawyers essentially have to take a wide range of events and persuade the jury that they all stem from one specific trigger. This leads directly into what's known as the same decision or mixed motive defense, which could become a key factor in the case. Even if the jury believes that Lively's complaint played some role, the defense can still argue that the same actions would have happened anyway, regardless of her complaint. Under California law, if the jury agrees with that, if they think those outcomes would have occurred for independent reasons, then they are required to side with the defense. It's a straightforward idea. If the decision would have been the same no matter what, then it's not legally considered retaliation. Lively's team is trying to push back on this by arguing that the defense can't have it both ways. They're essentially saying that if Wayfair acknowledges her protected activity, then the negative actions must logically be tied to it. They even use a dramatic analogy, comparing it to admitting to wrongdoing but trying to justify it with a separate motive. But Zambrano dismisses that comparison, explaining that employment law doesn't work like that. In these cases, defendants are absolutely allowed to present alternative explanations for their actions, and juries are specifically instructed to consider whether those alternative motives are valid. Ultimately, What Wayfair has done by agreeing to the protected activity element is narrow the battlefield, not surrender it. They've conceded one piece, but they're clearly preparing to fight hard on the most important issue, causation. They're expected to argue that the negative press, the PR decisions, the professional fallout, everything being labeled as retaliation, had other legitimate causes. And the judge is very unlikely to block that argument, because the law explicitly allows it. So while it may look like momentum for Lively on the surface, the reality is much more complex. The case now hinges on whether her team can convincingly connect all those dots, or whether the defense can persuade the jury that those dots were never truly connected in the first place. According to Ron Zambron, one thing is almost certain as this case moves forward: the judge is absolutely going to allow the defense to argue that their actions were motivated by something other than Blake Lively's complaint. That's not just a possibility, it's a fundamental part of how the law works in cases like this. The defense has every right to stand in court and say, our decisions weren't driven by her protected activity, they were driven by entirely different factors. And while Lively's team may try to block or limit that argument, it's extremely unlikely the judge would ever agree to that. Preventing a defendant from explaining their motive would essentially strip them of their ability to defend themselves, and no court is going to allow that. In fact, if anything, the defense's decision to concede the protected activity element may actually work in their favor with the court. By saying we're not going to waste time fighting over this one point, they come across as reasonable and efficient. Judges tend to appreciate that kind of approach, especially in a complex, high-profile case. So instead of that concession being used against them, it's more likely to be viewed as a smart, practical move that helps streamline the trial. But here's where the distinction really matters. Even though the defense is not disputing that Lively complained or that she believed she was dealing with a hostile work environment, they are still very much disputing that such an environment actually existed. And more importantly, they are disputing that any of their actions were taken because of her complaint. That keeps the core of the case wide open. This is where the defense strategy becomes clearer. They can argue that decisions like hiring crisis PR, handling media narratives, or any of the alleged fallout had nothing to do with retaliation. Instead, they can point to a completely different chain of events, one where they were reacting to circumstances they believed were created by Lively herself. And this is where Justin Baldoni's perspective comes into play. The defense can frame the situation as him responding to what he saw as being sidelined, excluded, or undermined, whether that's being distanced from his own project, cut out of key decisions, or facing reputational damage. If they can present enough examples, things like unfollowing on social media, internal conflicts, control over the film, or public-facing tensions, they can build an alternative narrative that their actions weren't retaliatory, but reactive. In other words, they weren't punishing Lively for speaking up. They were responding to a broader breakdown in the professional relationship. And legally, they're fully entitled to make that case. From there, it becomes a battle of storytelling. Both sides will present their version of events, and the jury will have to decide which explanation makes more sense. This is where the attorneys play a critical role, because it's not just about presenting facts. It's about connecting them in a way that feels logical and credible. Lively's team will need to minimize or discredit the defense's alternative explanations, possibly arguing that those reasons are just pretext, a cover story for retaliation. But as Zambrano points out, that's easier said than done, especially if the defense can point to multiple independent reasons for their actions. Another major development in this case is the possibility of the trial being split into phases, which sometimes happens when damages are especially complex. The first phase would focus on liability. Did retaliation actually occur? Only if the jury says yes would the case move into a second phase, where damages are calculated, and that's where expert witnesses become crucial. Both sides are currently fighting over whether their respective experts should even be allowed to testify. These are known as Daubert challenges, and they can have a massive impact. If an expert is excluded, it can completely weaken a party's ability to argue financial harm. For Lively, this is particularly important because she can't simply estimate her own losses on the stand. Without a qualified expert like an economist who can analyze data and project financial impact, any claim about lost income or future damages could be seen as speculation, which a jury isn't allowed to rely on. That means if her experts are limited or excluded, the potential damages she could recover may shrink significantly, regardless of what the jury believes about liability. Looking ahead, one of the most important things to watch will be the final verdict form, the set of questions the jury must answer after hearing all the evidence. That document essentially becomes the roadmap for the decision, breaking down each legal element step by step. It will reveal exactly what Lively needs to prove and where the defense will try to create doubt. At this point, all signs suggest the case is moving toward trial. While a settlement is always possible, the actions of both sides indicate they are preparing for a full courtroom battle. And if it does go to trial, it won't just be a legal fight, it will also play out in the court of public opinion. High-profile cases like this tend to attract intense scrutiny, and every detail, every testimony, and every argument will be picked apart in real time. In the end, even beyond the legal outcome, there's another factor that can't be ignored: perception. As Zambrano notes, in cases involving public figures, likability and public image can influence how a story is received. And with weeks of testimony, media coverage, and constant analysis, the reputational stakes may end up being just as significant as the legal ones. From a legal standpoint, Ron Zambrano explains that part of trial strategy in a high-profile case like this goes far beyond just legal arguments. It becomes deeply tied to public perception. When representing someone like Blake Lively, attorneys are not only thinking about the law, but also about how a jury is likely to feel about their client. And in reality, likability can quietly influence how evidence is interpreted, even if it's not supposed to. Zambrano points out that this is something experienced trial lawyers deal with constantly. At a certain level, part of the attorney's job becomes acting almost like a PR advisor, having brutally honest conversations with their client about how they may come across in front of a jury. That means discussing things that are often uncomfortable to hear, like whether a client is likable, how they perform under pressure, or how they might be perceived when testifying. In some cases, attorneys even have to directly tell clients hard truths, that they may not perform well in front of a jury, or that their personality could hurt their credibility. It's not personal, it's strategic. If a jury doesn't connect with a witness, it can affect everything from liability to damages. That's why lawyers often stress preparation,